Hello and welcome to another episode of Fundy Tidings. I'm your host Jay Remer, and back with me today is Hailey Flaro. Hailey is the Executive Director of Ability New Brunswick. Welcome back to the show, Hailey.
Thank you for having me.
It's so exciting. There's so much going on in the world of people with mobility disabilities as far as improving their lot, so to speak, and reducing their suffering. And so today I thought we might talk about some additional things. And I'd like to start off by acknowledging that you are a wonderful writer. And the editorials that I've read, that you've written about people with mobility disabilities, they've been very compassionate and informative and incredibly helpful to educate the public about the matter. And so what I'm wondering, you've been doing this for a few years, how successfully has the government responded to the challenges that people with mobility disabilities have, that you have highlighted in your editorials? How have they done?
You're very kind, thank you. So Ability New Brunswick, we work with those with a mobility disability, and while we deliver services, the public policy piece is equally important. Our board of directors wants to make sure we're always engaging in public policy to make change. Otherwise, we're just going to spin our wheels on the service delivery part. So we constantly are researching, developing briefs, presenting to government on changes to policy, and some of that is those opinion articles that you mentioned as well, to also educate the general public. If we don't have the general public on board, it's hard to change the mind of a political leader. So we've had lots of success in making policy changes that are responsive to the needs of New Brunswickers with a disability. For example, we've made changes to social assistance to allow people to keep more of their income if they start a job and explore their ability to work, and what that can look like if it's part-time to start. We have had lots of success in having influence on the inclusive education policy. It's been very positive for our population. It's meant physical education specialists looking at adapted sport and recreation in phys ed, so everyone plays sledge or uses a hand cycle or plays wheelchair basketball. It's meant schools now look at physical spaces and know that just because a child can get in the front door, they also need to be able to access the stage because maybe they want to perform. Yeah. And then we go on school trips that they need to take care to look for an accessible bus because it's not right to leave the child with a disability behind. So there's been lots of policy changes that have been positive. One recent one was the emergency benefit for home support workers in the province that was being offered by the federal government. Initially, it was set up just to provide wage top-ups to those that worked for agencies. Now, Ability NB's clients, 60% of them hire privately because agencies may not be available in their region, or maybe agencies can't provide the high level of care they need. So you can imagine the concern that this gave our clients, because it was going to demonstrate that our communities, our government didn't support private home support workers, and without them, every nursing home hospital would be teeming. So we worked with government to make sure that benefit and top-up was also available to home support workers, which did a lot in morale to show that any home support worker that's giving their gift of time and experience to help people with a disability, seniors, to be independent, is really important. Mm-hmm. Those are some of the successes we've had.
I think that's great, because I think it's important to give the system or the government a credit where credit's due. So making these changes is incremental but helpful. But the bigger question is, where are the shortfalls in the service delivery?
Definitely, and Ability NB works so closely with government, even municipalities. And if you look in this region, what's happening on accessible trails, or so many good stories, because government's also municipalities and towns and rural service districts, right? But the shortfalls, are common things we're hearing, in media and discourse. a lack of affordable, accessible housing. We have a significant demand in New Brunswick. In my 24 years in nonprofit, I've seen more people using mobility devices living on the streets than I've ever seen in my life. Many of our homeless shelters and transition homes, most of them are not accessible. So if you have a mobility disability and need type that emergency support, it's often not available. So we're constantly trying to find other solutions for safe housing. We need, it's not just a government issue, it's a community issue. We need developers building more affordable, accessible housing.
Yeah.
It's a huge need. Employment. We recently did a study on the economic impact of disability and employment in New Brunswick. It was actually Premier Higgs, when he was former finance minister. He used to always welcome me to come and talk about the budget, right? And he'd listen. And he said, we don't have a good idea to show the business community of what the economic impacts are, the social impacts there. We all know how we feel when we have a job. It brings meaning to our lives. We can support ourselves and our family. But with the study that we did last year showed that we could move 22,000 people with a disability into the workforce in New Brunswick. And you see this 100,000 number of vacancies we're going to have in labor market over the next. What an opportunity. Yeah. Has the potential for 1.97 billion annually in GDP and 220 million annually in tax benefit. Forget all the social good, right? There's a business case to the province. So we need to be, employment first employers. We need to be looking at the inclusion and hiring of people with a disability. The pandemic has been helpful for that because employers have learned so much about job customization and job modification. It's not about people with a disability anymore. This is what we need to do as employers to engage people in our workplace. So those are some of the gaps that still exist. And poverty, like I said, you and I've talked about previously, people with a disability and single mothers are the two most impoverished population in this province. And there's been a lot of great poverty initiatives, but it's time to target some initiatives to those populations. Like the child care has been a perfect example that's helped lift many single mothers out of poverty. So what can be done now to lift people with a disability out of poverty? That's something we continue to work with government to find better supports to address those issues, because living with a disability is costly. Accessible transportation is twice the cost of regular transportation. If you're a student, you get the same student loan as a student with a disability. A student with a disability gets the same student loan as a student without a disability, but your accessible apartment is twice the cost. So there's all kinds of inequities.
So inequities still exist, and they likely will. And you raised an interesting point about Premier Higgs questioning the business model, which is what you would expect a finance minister to do. So that's appropriate. But I think that it's unfortunately what I see happening is that there has to be a business case in order to support a social justice issue, and I find I personally have a problem with that. But in one of your editorials, you write about visitable housing. And I'd never heard the term visitable housing. And I thought, well, does that mean that I have to have a ramp at Granny's to go visit her? Or what does it actually mean? So I thought maybe you could educate us on the concept of visitable housing.
Perfect. It's a lesser known term, but what it really means is that it's a standard to develop single family homes that would have 3 basic accessibility features. Doesn't mean they don't have 2 floors, but they would have at least 1 0 level or ramped entrance. It would have an accessible bathroom on the main floor, and it would have at least 36-inch wide doorways. What this does, it's really, in communities in Manitoba, there's a developer in Manitoba that has years of wait lists for people to move into his visible housing developments. And these aren't just people with disabilities, they're seniors, they're families with young children. Who doesn't want to move a couch into a 0 level home? So what this is we're really starting some work to encourage municipalities, service districts, the province to take a look at some visitability bylaws or regulations that would require a certain percentage of newly built dwellings to have these features. And there's a huge I know we just talked about economic case, but there's a social case because enable people to age in place, reduce falls, visit neighbors. I have a close friend that has a high-level disability, and when we looked for our new house, I couldn't find an accessible home everywhere, but we found a home that was easily ramped so he can access our open concept floor. The bathroom is not fully accessible, but somewhat. It was the best we could find. So it enables, reduces falls, helps people age in place longer. And the economic case is if you have a split level entry home right now and need a lift elevator to be able to go through your home, it's about $40,000. If you need an accessible bathroom renovation, it could be about $40,000. What senior has $80,000 to spend on modifications to stay at home? So we're really excited about this new trend because I believe we really need, there's so many split level entry homes on the market right now. We need more visitable housing that can be designed for people to age in place. If you have an illness and need to be able to live on the main floor of your house for a period, a visitable home would provide that.
So, you know, people who cannot access these services suffer. And I'm wondering, I always like to kind of have statistics, not that you are going to have a statistic here, but there are a lot of people who are going to be falling through the cracks. And I'm just wondering, there is a level of responsibility on government to care for these people. And I'm just wondering, how is that handled right at the moment?
It's difficult. So in New Brunswick, that we have the benefit of a small province, so I find our rural communities do it better. I've always said to government that if you want to find a best practice in service delivery, go to the St. Stephen's and the Dalhousie's, because the housing officers, the case managers, the social workers, they all talk. They often work in the same buildings, and it's really that person-centered model. Where we get complications is often in our rural community, or in our urban centers, where you know, there's not that level of partnership. There's really high rosters and caseloads. For example, social workers in New Brunswick are telling me they have 200 people, you know, on their caseloads. How do you meet with a person regularly if you have 200 people? How do you even remember and follow up on their goals? These are wonderful social workers, but our system is preventing them able to carry out the scope of their job, the advocacy, the looking for funding, helping assess people's goals.
Well, I know Dorothy Shepherd has come out with a 21-point plan recently for dealing with mental health, mostly emergencies. And it really does reveal just exactly what you've said. And I think that we, you know, one of the solutions that I feel is likely is that the communities and the individual families and so forth will be taking more responsibility in helping one another, say through peer intervention or that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, how does that fit into your plans?
It is the work in the nonprofit sector is never just about us versus government. It's about community's role, the nonprofit role, the business role, the government role. The challenge, so one of the great benefits of New Brunswick is we have strong communities. When someone's dealing with a difficulty, a trauma, people rally together. It's amazing the Good Samaritans I see all the time that come forward to raise money for things that aren't covered by insurance and to help people modify their home and to do friendly visiting, provides peer support and encouragement. That is never going to disappear. That's about strong communities. And, you know, a lot of us grew up where we were taught to be good neighbors. I remember helping my mom, you know, there was always a list of who needed for friendly visiting and baking. And, you know, you when someone was going through grief, you know, you made a casserole, you checked in on people, you sent a card, you told them to please call if you needed something, and people would. We really have to continue to strengthen our communities to know that we can't rely on any one group or organization or government to be that safety net. So always being, you know, the church in New Brunswick, it's amazing how many churches have helped the people we work with. It's a part of our exploration all the time just to find out if people are connected to one, because we know that's an added support, maybe for drives, maybe for food help, maybe for just some social support and reduce isolation. But peer support in the mental health strategy is so important. It's not just clinical support. Our population needs to talk to someone that's been there. I can yammer all day and provide counseling to someone newly diagnosed with ALS, but there is nothing like talking to someone else who is going through it, dealing with it, and can talk about what they've learned, what they do differently.
Yeah. So I guess that it kind of boils down to what can the government do to help, and how can we help influence the government to carry through with these ideas? So, I mean, do we write our MLAs? Do we call them up on the phone? What are kind of the things that, if I was to call your office, you would tell me to do?
Community conversations are so important. We really encourage people to be engaged. A lot of people have become disenfranchised with the political process, and I always tell our service participants, voting is a right that you have to share your voice. You have a right to email your MLA and say, I'd like to know what's going to be done about affordable, accessible housing. I'd like to know what is going to be done to help poverty and people with a disability. So I think, whether it's contacting an MLA or going to a local town discussion on a topic about making a more accessible community, I think it's really important for all of us to have that disability lens and to ask questions. If there's a new playground being designed and it doesn't have any accessible features, well, we're leaving kids on the sideline. I tell you, before I retire in, 20 years, I don't want to hear one more story of a kid that sits on the sidelines because there's no accessible features to a playground. It doesn't mean there's no slide. It means that there's crusher dust and or pavement or well-drained area, that there's features, tactile X and O games, and maybe some ramping and some bars that you can lift and interact with. So we really have to be putting that lens on design of communities, but our community conversations. And some people call it gossip. I call it really good community building, when your neighbor says, I hear Joan's having a tough time, I'm going to stop in on her, you might want to too. Yeah.
Well, I think, gossip usually has a sharp edge to it, and your organization has rounded edges and kindness. What are some of the stigmas around people with disabilities, and and how does it fit into the discussion around the words that we use?
It's still a big issue. Words hurt. We know that. People use words to hurt other people, and there's certain words that are quite stigmatizing to the population of people with disability. When I was young, my mom, there was all kinds of terms thrown about her because she had differences, because she walked differently, and that really stung. And when I hear some of those words today, it just hits me, because to me it was all in a negative discourse. It was describing her in a negative way and wasn't recognizing her talents, her kindness, her ability. We still see so much bullying in schools of kids that have differences, and we need to escalate our discussions about differences. My family did that at a really early age because we had a lot of diversity in our family, and it's so important to understand that. Language, the person first language is so important. Person with a disability, person using a device, they're not in it, they're not stuck in it, they're using it as an aid to help do what they need to do. That's usually our guide. The H word that we used to describe disability, I still see people putting it on signs. We don't even need to put language on signs. If you're building an accessible parking spot, that blue universal design symbol is enough. So it's really important to be conscious of language and know that a lot of language has really historical negative connotations, and we're trying to change the language to be more positive and inclusive. There's very few times in my day where I need to say person with a disability, except if I'm talking about what my organization does. It's Jim, and Jim's living with MS, and these are all the amazing things that Jim does to be independent and active and help his peers. So it's really being conscious of how we describe others, but I think all of us need to go back to our kitchen tables tonight and talk about differences and how we value them and how they're so important and how they help us learn and become more celebrate diversity, and how they help the innovation that different perspectives brings. Like people with a disability are inventing all kinds of devices because they bring that perspective of dealing with a roadblock.
I think it's, I can remember when I first met Carla, and she was explaining to me, it was beyond the H word, but people with disabilities, the concept of people living with as opposed to having. Yeah. Just that distinction puts the relationship on a different footing. And people who have disabilities are, Carla was saying, it's not that they're disabled, it's they're differently abled. Because people get around. I mean, they manage to get around. But they have so many positive attributes that they can contribute that we don't see because we can't take our blinders off. And I think it's a societal problem that we need to kind of warm up to. So the question would be, how can the general public help with reducing the suffering of people with mobility issues?
I think one of the things is when you're designing a program, a service, when you have a building, if you're not accessible and inclusive for our population, you're limiting 12% of New Brunswickers from coming in the door. So communities really need to think about how our program services and communities can be more accessible to people. There's some great work happening in St. Andrews right now with the trails and different landings, and they're looking at an adapted exercise park. Like, those are pretty exciting things that everyone in the community is going to be able to enjoy. So that's one piece, that talking to political leaders and community leaders about changes you want to see. A great question is, how are we making sure that the voices of people with a disability are being engaged in this process, in this design, in this program, in this initiative, in this financial decision? It's something we all have a right to ask, and we don't want to see forgotten, because there's going to be cost to the individual and there's going to be cost to the community over the long term. So. And I talked about having those conversations about differences. I don't think they can start early enough, and the value in differences, like you just said, everyone has ability and potential, and we have to take time to see what other people's talents are.
Well, I know here in St. Andrews, we've had a couple of different initiatives. One has been the age-friendly community, so we're now designated an age-friendly community. And I remember going to the meetings about that, and accommodating people with disabilities was a pivotal point, because this is age-friendly, is all ages, and we begin to break down as we get older, and some of us start off with a sort of disabilities that we need special attention for. And the other is the trail system that's gone through the town. And as you said, we do live in a pancake, and so the challenges were maybe a little bit less here, but even on Minister's Island we deal with these things, and even here in the arena, an elevator was put in so people could get around. And these kinds of things, I think, are hopefully beginning to take hold and really get some traction. So in closing, what are your goals and aspirations for this subject that you have invested much of your meaningful life in?
2021 marks our 65th anniversary, and I look forward to another 65th anniversary. Looked forward to another 65 years. Our lights are still on. Our doors are still open. I want anyone listening to this interview to reach out. They can reach out to me personally if they think we might be able to help them or a family member. There's lots of exciting things happening. The adapted sport and recreation program, so the cost of equipment isn't a barrier to people. Our Transition MB program is working with youth with a mobility disability to make sure they go on to post-secondary and jobs, and they can have a one-on-one planner with our organization to help navigate scholarships and technology and getting the right assessments and finding accessible housing. One of the things we're formalizing is we're getting a lot of requests for communities to do accessibility reviews, and we have a funding proposal in to expand that so we can do more of those reviews and give positive recommendations to the town and say, listen, this is where you kind of met the regulations and the standards, and here's some areas where you could improve, and that really aligns with the age-friendly communities you mentioned. Sometimes adding strategic benches is just so helpful for people that need a little rest and want to use the trails but are afraid to go out because they think I won't be able to stop and have a rest on the trail because maybe they live with a condition that limits their mobility or their respiratory conditions. So there's lots of exciting things for our organization. I'd like to say we could turn the lights off and close the doors, but we have a lot of public policy work to do with government. We research with our population and provide a voice to a population that often doesn't have a voice. And I'm just really excited about all that's left to come. I have a vision for an accessible New Brunswick. You mentioned St. Andrews, and you have one of the few accessible curling rinks in the province. There's none in Fredericton, and yet, we have an individual that's a friend of our organization that curls in St. Andrews. It's amazing, just those type of inequities that exist in the province, and you have a lot to celebrate here in Charlotte County.
Hailey, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. It's been really informative, and I hope you'll come back and talk about this some more as new programs develop and government is even more on side. And thank you all for watching the show today, and I look forward to seeing you again on another episode of Fundy Tidings.